off with how has Rome affected us? You want to get the lights, Mr. Speaker Man, microphone guy. All right. So how has Rome affected us? And from these pictures, you can see that a little bit of architecture to start off with. Anybody know what the building is off to the left-hand side there? It's called
Colosseum.
The Colosseum. Okay. So how has the Colosseum affected us today? We have what? We have modern-day stadiums that kind of reflect that idea of the Colosseum. Okay. Now the Colosseum is not the only structure. I mean, Rome. This was found in the city of Rome, but Colosseum-like structures were built throughout the entirety of the Roman Empire. And one reason for that was try to appease the needs of the plebeians. You guys remember the social class system that we reflected on yesterday a little bit in class? The plebeians were the lower class type of people, but that made up the masses, right? What was the upper class level? It was another P word at the top. The patricians. So the patricians were the rich and the wealthy. They weren't necessarily so much concerned about going to the Colosseum. The Colosseum was for the masses, so that essentially those people in authoritative positions in the Roman government, they put out these Colosseums and they have all these different types of games. They have the gladiatorial battles. They have other type of competition. They'd actually flood the bottom of the Colosseum, and then have recreate these naval battles from like the old, either the Punic Wars or the Peloponnesian War, recreate those type of things, and it was an aspect of entertainment for them, okay? So if they were entertained, then what were they less likely to get upset about? They're poor people. Less likely to get upset about, the natural things of life. So crime, poverty, other aspects of the downfall of urbanization, living inside of Rome. Okay, so they were distracting them, I guess you could put it that way. Okay, entertainment was a form of distraction, a way of appeasing the needs of the plebeian type of class in Rome. Sound good? So we kind of do that today, right? We have football, right, on Sundays. I mean, think about it in the fall. How many times are your Sundays affected by football? Right? I mean, we do our Sunday thing, whether it's going to church or not, and then Sunday afternoon, we want to go home, want to watch a football game, right? We want to watch the Bears game, or whatever football team that we follow.
Even though I don't know how to make good draft picks.
Right. They did make a bad mistake yesterday. We assumed that they were going to make a bad mistake, so they did make a mistake. But the idea is, even if we aren't watching personally Super Bowl or football, think about how many people in the American culture watch football, right? And so, in a way, the NFL is distracting a lot of people in American culture from what? If we can think about the NFL and we can talk about it all day long, then we're not talking about what? Exactly. We're not talking about other things that we could be complaining about. So in a way, the NFL and football is a way to appease the needs of the masses, to give us something to focus on, so we're not focused on crime and poverty and social programs, taxes, whatever else it may be. Okay, it's a way to distract us. So we have some connections on how Rome has affected us today. So the football player is kind of like the modern-day gladiator. How else has Rome affected us? Language. Write language down there. So, of course, our main point off the left-hand side, how has Rome affected us? Number one would be, of course, entertainment, creation of stadiums and those types of things. The second point here on the right-hand side would be language. Let's watch this short video clip on where does the English language come from. This is another TED Ed, if you haven't had enough of TED Ed over the last day or so.
When we talk about English, we often think of it as a single language. But what do the dialects spoken in dozens of countries around the world have in common with each other, or with the writings of Chaucer? And how are any of them related to the strange words in Beowulf? The answer is that, like most languages, English has evolved through generations of speakers, undergoing major changes over time. By undoing these changes, we can trace the language from the present day back to its ancient roots. While modern English shares many similar words with Latin-derived Romance languages like French and Spanish, most of those words were not originally part of it. Instead, they started coming into the language with the Norman invasion of England in 1066. When the French-speaking Normans conquered England and became its ruling class, they brought their speech with them, adding a massive amount of French and Latin vocabulary to the English language previously spoken there. Today, we call that language Old English. This is the language of Beowulf. It probably doesn't look very familiar, but it might be more recognizable if you know some German. That's because Old English belongs to the Germanic language family, first brought to the British Isles in the 5th and 6th centuries by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Germanic dialects they spoke would become known as Anglo-Saxon. Viking invaders in the 8th to 11th centuries added more borrowings from Old Norse into the mix. It may be hard to see the roots of modern English underneath all the words borrowed from French, Latin, Old Norse, and other languages. But comparative linguistics can help us by focusing on grammatical structure, patterns of sound changes, and certain core vocabulary. For example, after the 6th century, German words starting with P systematically shifted to a PF sound, while their Old English counterparts kept the P unchanged. In another split, words that have SK sounds in Swedish developed an SH sound in English. There are still some English words with SK, like skirt and skull, but they're direct borrowings from Old Norse that came after the SK to SH shift. These examples show us that just as the various Romance languages descended from Latin, English, Swedish, German, and many other languages descended from their own common ancestor, known as Proto-Germanic, spoken around 500 BCE. Because this historical language was never written down, we can only reconstruct it by comparing its descendants, which is possible thanks to the consistency of the changes. We can even use the same process to go back one step further and trace the origins of Proto-Germanic to a language called Proto-Indo-European, spoken about 6,000 years ago on the Pontic steppe in modern-day Ukraine and Russia. This is the reconstructed ancestor of the Indo-European family that includes nearly all languages historically spoken in Europe, as well as large parts of southern and western Asia. And though it requires a bit more work, we can find the same systematic similarities or correspondences between related words in different Indo-European branches. Comparing English with Latin, we see that English has T where Latin has D, and F where Latin has P at the start of words. Some of English's more distant relatives include Hindi, Persian, and the Celtic languages it displaced in what is now Britain. Proto-Indo-European itself descended from an even more ancient language, but unfortunately, this is as far back as historical and archaeological evidence will allow us to go. Many mysteries remain just out of reach, such as whether there might be a link between Indo-European and other major language families, and the nature of the languages spoken in Europe prior to its arrival. But the amazing fact remains that nearly 3 billion people around the world, many of whom cannot understand each other, are nevertheless speaking the same words shaped by 6,000 years of history.
Right, so of course, whenever we think about language, which of those languages really is associated with Rome that influences us? It begins with an L. Which one is that, Garrett?
Latin.
It would be the Latin language, okay? So you may want to write that up to the side, maybe in parentheses, Latin, next to Rome. So it's kind of interesting. So I'm glad that we watched that because after we get finished with talking about Rome, we're focused on the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and that's really when we focus on their Germanic tribes. We're going to look at these a little bit more next week. We call them barbarians, barbarian groups. And those are the predecessors for the Anglos, the Saxons, the Germans, the Franks, those type of things. Okay? And those really impacted our language as well. One other way in which Rome has affected us today is government. Write that down. Number 3, government. So we looked at this a little bit yesterday with our bell work, with some of the questions, with the consuls. You guys remember what a consul was? Remember Cicero? Remember putting him into our crossword puzzle yesterday? A consul is kind of like a president, an early president. Before they had these Roman emperors take over, they had a consul. And a consul, they had 2 consuls that actually balanced each other out. And so initially they had this system of government where they would have different branches and they protected each other, all right? So that one particular part of government wouldn't be able to grow stronger than all the others. So our concept of our 3-pronged government, our legislative, executive, and judicial branch, we got that idea of balance of power from the Romans there. A really pretty impressive concept, okay? Representation, a representative democracy, you may write that out to the side as well. That idea comes from the Romans as well. So it's an indirect form of democracy. You remember the Greeks had a direct form of democracy where if you were a citizen, you participated in the assembly. In Rome, it's an indirect form where you had elected representatives to participate in the Senate. And then they would make all the legislature. They would do all the lawmaking there, okay? Have you guys ever heard of the Ides of March before? The Ides of March. Fear the Ides of March. That's March 15th. I'm going to write this out to the side as well. Maybe put an asterisk next to it. It's good for us to know. March 15th, the Ides of March. It's the date in which Julius Caesar was in the Senate. And what happened to him?
He was murdered.
Yeah, how was he murdered? He was stabbed.
Stabbed, like, by everyone.
In what body part? In the back. He was stabbed in the back. So that's why they say, fear the Ides of March. Watch those people that are closest to us that you think are your friends, because that's what it was Julius Caesar's closest friends, Brutus, Thomas, the ones that were closest to, they turned on him. Okay. Now the reason why they turned on him is because his power himself, he was going to organize all the aspects of governmental power into one position, the emperor. He was going to make himself sole ruler of Rome. And when he was doing that, how do you think the senators felt? The people that were part of the assembly felt like they're overlooked, right? Like they're powerless and they're worthless. So they didn't want that to happen. So what do? They killed him, right? Even if they had very close, they didn't want that balance of power to be gone. So they killed him. Okay. So keep that in the back of your mind. You guys want to watch this video on concrete? All right. Number 4, how has Rome affected us today? Concrete. Watch this real quick as well. This one's a little bit shorter.
Well, they call it a concrete jungle, and it certainly is. Actually, it's more like a concrete swamp. In fact, concrete defines the modern 20th century city. It was the invention of reinforced concrete that allowed architects like Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright to design extraordinary structures like this. But the other thing is, they were building concrete 2,000 years ago. Now, run, please. The Pantheon here was built by the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, and its dome is still one of the largest concrete domes in the world. It's 50 yards across, and the concrete is up to 20 feet thick. The word concrete comes from the Latin concretus, meaning grown together or hardened. Roman concrete was a mixture of sand, powdered limestone, and stone rubble, pretty well what it is today. To construct arches and vaults, the Romans also developed a liter mix, and the higher they went, the lighter they made the concrete. In this way, they could roof over much larger areas than would be possible with stone. One of the problems with concrete is that even after it's hardened, it still absorbs water. So the Romans added a mix of volcanic cinders and clay called pozzolana. Pozzolana reacts with the lime in the mortar and sets quickly. Most important of all, it's resistant to water. The Romans had invented damp-proof concrete, and they used it for the foundation of buildings like the Pantheon, for lining reservoirs, and for constructing harbours. Concrete allowed the Romans to build big and fast, and thus imposed their authority on tribes still living in simple structures of wood or mud. Concrete may well have been one of the secret weapons of the Roman Empire.
Alright, sounds pretty good stuff. I think it's really important for us to take note of the construction aspects of the Roman culture as well. Alright, point number 2, main point on to the left-hand side, Rome's origination stories. First off, there's 2 stories that I want you to take note of. One is Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus, the story goes that there was these 2 boys, and they were left to die. They were feral children, what you classify as feral children. You ever heard of feral cats before? Feral cats are cats that are, like parentless cats. You guys ever heard of those before? So these are feral children. Again, this is Greek mythology, or not, it's Roman mythology. And so they were left alone to survive on their own in the wilderness. And supposedly, they were raised by wolves for a period of time. Okay. Then a shepherd comes along, sees these 2 boys, rescues them from living with these wolves, and then socializes them, humanizes them, and raises them as if they were his own. Okay. Later on, Romulus and Remus, they go back to the spot where they were rescued from the wolves by this sheep herder, and they decide to signify that point in time in their life by building a city there. So they start to construct walls for this city, and what happens was Romulus was building a wall, and Remus, to show the insufficiency of Romulus's wall, he jumped over the wall. Romulus took great offense to Remus making fun of his wall, so Romulus ended up killing Remus, and Rome was then consequently named after Romulus thereafter. Sound good? So that's one of the mythological stories associated with Rome. The other one is about the Aeneid. I'm not sure if this one's going to work. Doesn't look like it.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so we're not going to be able to watch this. The Aeneid, go ahead and write this out to the side. Aeneid, A-E-N, I believe it's E-I-D. And I can't remember the author of the Aeneid. It's not Homer. It's somebody else. But in this particular story, it says that the earliest inhabitants of Rome were actually those that fled the destruction of Troy at the end of the Trojan War. Right? So that they escaped. So these great, they thought of Troy as being a great civilization at one point in time. Right? So those that escaped, you remember when they put the Trojan horse, the Mycenaean men, Greeks brought in the Trojan horse, and then they sacked the city, they burned it to the ground, and so those that survived eventually made it all the way to Rome to become the earliest founders of Rome. Sound good? So that's the other story. Rome's rise to power, so this is not Roman mythology, this is actually true stuff. We referenced this a little bit yesterday in our bell work as well. Called these the Punic Wars. So maybe write this, Rome's rise to an empire, main point on the left side, right side, write Punic Wars. You may want to write the number 3 next to the Punic Wars because there were 3 wars altogether. In each of these wars, it's a fight between Carthage and Rome. And you may write that out to the side, right-hand side as well, Carthage and Rome. You can see Carthage is right here on the northern portion of Africa. This is Spain, this is Europe. Here's the boots of Italy, and of course here's Rome. Right through there, okay? So what it was Rome as became more and more powerful at the time as of their growth. Carthage was actually the largest city-state, most influential city-state of the Mediterranean. And so it was inevitable that if they were going to grow and expand even farther, that they were going to come into contact with Carthage. And Carthage, during this Punic War, during all 3 of them, in each one, they were so close to winning. And it's like somehow the Romans, had something go their way, and they turned the tides of the battle. and they're able to win each of the Punic Wars. Right? There's a story about a Carthaginian leader. His name is Hannibal. You can write his name out to the side. Hannibal, 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 and he was this great Carthaginian general. What he decided to do was do a sneak attack of the Romans. He's from Africa, Canada, or Carthage is in Africa. They have access to these African elephants. So what they did was they took these African elephants that go all the way over here to the Iberian Peninsula with what is now modern-day Spain, and they took these African elephants across this strait here and came all the way up through France and crossed the Alps, took the elephants down through the Alps, and then attacked Rome from the north. So it was like a sneak attack, and the Romans never expected it. It was quite the successful feat of the Carthaginians. But ultimately, the Romans did defeat the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars. At the conclusion of the last war, they wanted to make sure that the Carthaginians couldn't come back. So what the Romans did, after they sacked Carthage, they go to all of their fields, what they were using to produce all their crops, and they threw salt all over it. Put salt all over it so that they can't regrow. They can't. It's worthless soil thereafter. Okay. So if you take their food source away, it's really going to harm them, hurt them overall. Lane, you had a question?
Oh, you got the, what was his name?
Hannibal, Hannibal. Got a question, Mr. Ellis?
Is that soil still like worthless?
I'm not sure. Today, you'd have to look that up. I'm not sure if it's, become fertile once again or not. All right, let's focus on Roman architecture. So a main point off to the left-hand side as well. Just a few more notes to finish up. One thing that I want you to take note of is the difference between Greek architecture and Roman architecture. If you go back to Greece today, it's pretty cool. Never been there myself, but seen pictures and stuff and studies. But you got all of these Greek city-state ruins, right? And it's fairly impressive because of what they were able to do at that point in time. But all of the Greek structures, most of them are based off of a post and lintel system, okay? A post and lintel system, and I'll explain what that is here in a second. And you can see remnants of the post and lintel system in Roman architecture, but Rome kind of progresses away from that, okay? The Roman architecture really focuses on arches and vaulting. And that large cathedral ceiling, the one that was highlighted in the video with it made of the concrete, it's reflective of the arches and the large vaulting aspect of their construction. Okay, this is a post and lintel system. Okay, Preston and I play with blocks, and the way that we play with blocks is we can only do the post and lintel system. We got these blocks that we can stand them up, and then we can post things on top of them. Right? We can't. The blocks aren't malleable. We can't change them and affect the shape of them, so we can't create any dome-like structures or anything like that. So we're limited to this. So were the Greeks in a way. So what it did was you could create these huge structures, but inside of the structures, you weren't. It's not like you could create a large open space because you had to have constant posts to hold up the ceiling. Everybody understand how that works? Because everything was just laid across that way. It's just no large open spaces in the post and lintel system. You can see aspects. Anybody know where this is at? It's Washington, D.C. You know who's up in there? Yeah, that's the Lincoln Memorial. So you can see the post and lintel system replicated in our own culture. This is the vaulted ceiling aspect, right, of the Roman culture. See how you have the open space? How much more open space is created? Okay, this is because of the arches, and what happens is they'll funnel with the arch, it funnels all of the pressure towards they call it a keystone there towards the top, and all that pressure sits on that keystone, and it holds itself together that way. So fairly impressive feat what they were able to come up with. You can see the arch. See, this would be a keystone right here, right there, right there. And with the arch, you can cover a lot more ground as well. You might know what this is called? It was highlighted yesterday about the aqueduct. So it's bringing water from, a clean source of water over a long stretch of land, and you could, bring water to communities that way. So fairly impressive feat there as well. All right, a couple luxuries of being Roman, aspects of the Roman way of life. One would be Roman baths. They had 3 different types of Roman baths. They had one called a frigidarium. Think of it kind of like, everything's like a gymnasium. A frigidarium, so that would be what kind of what kind of water do you think they'd have? Cold water. So all these baths would be together. You have a frigidarium, and then you have a tepidarium. What would be the tepidarium? Not hot. Yeah, it's room temperature, tepid. All right, and then you have it's a cauldrarium, and that would be hot, like a cauldron, right? Hot water bath. And so you had access to that. I think it was probably highlighted in your Roman video yesterday, right? As well. They also, a lot of times in these locations with these Roman baths, they would have a gymnasium. Now the gymnasium is a little bit different concept than what our gymnasium is, but it would be more like a facility in which they could exercise that way, okay? More like a weight room. They also had public restrooms. Public restrooms. I'm working on a study right now on toilets, a cross-cultural study on restrooms. And we'll get to that maybe a little bit later. But this was quite the luxury for being a Roman citizen. Now you can see that there's not much privacy with these public toilets. The other thing that's associated with it is all of the toilets, the public toilets were connected to the sewage system, which is fairly impressive in itself for its time period, where they were able to get the sewage away from the city type of environment. But the other thing that you have to worry about is the sewage system. A lot of times they were connected to the like the rivers and or even the larger body of water like the Mediterranean and sea itself, and they didn't have any type of anything that would stop the flow of going backwards up. All right, they just assumed that everything would go out, and so what could potentially come back up that way?
All the waste.
I mean, waste could. I mean, if it flooded, it could come back up that way. But what else? What else is in water? Fish or other types of organisms. Okay. So one downside of going to a public restroom, using a public facility like this, was the potential that you could be exposed to some, reptilian type animal as well, coming up and get the backside, get your backside that way. Okay? So that would be one downfall. Right? Again, they did have a sewage system, so that's fairly impressive. But again, if it flooded, that would be an issue. Last thing, Roman government. We already hit on this just a little bit. They did transition from a monarchy, kind of like the Greeks. We had the political progressions, monarchy, aristocracy, tyranny, and then democracy. The transition for the Roman government is really focused from a monarchy. Early on, they were ruled by a cultural group called the Etruscans, and they had Etruscan kings. They had a series of 7 Etruscan kings to start off with, and then eventually they transitioned from that to an assembly and representative type of government, a more what they call a Roman republic, right? Let's see. They did have a senate to advise and consent these early kings, and eventually the senate gained more and more power. It says the early stages of the republic was dominated by the patricians and left the plebeians without representation. So early on, the patricians pretty much made all the power, made all the decisions. Now again, the patricians are a very small percentage of the population, and then to appease the needs of the masses, they created another assembly separate from the initial assembly for the plebeians. And initially, they didn't have any power. They just had an assembly. It really wasn't, they really didn't do anything. Eventually, they did gain the power to veto laws created by the patricians. So that was fairly impressive. So you get to see the balance of powers, kind of like what we have today with our representative government and a legislative branch, where we have a House of Representatives and the Senate there as well. So you got a lot of connections between what we have in our government to what they had in theirs. Okay. We kind of already talked about those things there. Does anybody have any questions about Rome? No? So you can see how it's impacted our culture quite a bit. All right, I'll give you a few minutes here at the end of class. You can read from your race text for the remainder of class. Sound good?